At 65, the tragedy of Simon Cowell is beyond heartbreaking. He was the architect of modern fame, the unsmiling oracle who could turn a shaky audition into a global coronation. From a forgotten mailroom clerk to the most powerful figure in Saturday night television, he built an empire on cold truth and impossible standards. American Idol, The X Factor, Got Talent. Entire generations rose and fell beneath his raised eyebrow, yet the spotlight that crowned him also carved him open. Behind the ratings and roar lived a life scorched by scandal, by the ache of a father's silence, by nights when the applause faded and the room stayed loud with doubt. The fall wasn't just metaphor. In 2020, a split second on an electric bike shattered his back and nearly ended everything. In 2022, another crash mocked the first. The mirror betrayed him too, years of injectables that left him unrecognizable until he finally said, "I went too far," and let time etch the truth back into his face. Salvation arrived in small hands. His son Eric, born in the wake of a scandal that turned the judge into the judge and branded his name across headlines he could not control. Then came grief that no empire could price out. He buried his parents, and in 2024, the news from Buenos Aires cut like a blade. Liam Payne, the boy he placed into One Direction, dead at 31. For a man who manufactured stardom with precision, that loss rewired the meaning of power. The titan who minted dreams found himself praying for ordinary days, a painless morning, a bedtime story, a life lived gently. This isn't the tale of a villain redeemed. It's the anatomy of a survivor who learned too late that fame is a bargain written in fine print and paid in private. Simon Cowell did not simply make television. He engineered a public ritual. Each week, ordinary people brought trembling voices to a bright, merciless altar, and a man in a white t-shirt, half smile, frozen between kindness and contempt, decided whether those voices would echo or vanish. American Idol. The X Factor Got Talent formats, exported like steel and cinema, turned living rooms into jury boxes and Saturday nights into civic events. He wasn't the host or the star, he was the weather. When he frowned, ratings spiked. When he paused, eyes narrowed, breath withheld. Entire countries leaned forward to inhabit that silence with their own dreams. The origin myth reads cleanly: an A&R grinder who learned that connection outsells perfection, a fixer who could hear a chorus hooked through the static of a bad audition. The truth runs messier and more human. He was forged by invisibility, overlooked at school, minimized at work, fed on the chill of withheld praise, then hardened by bankruptcy that sent him back to his childhood bedroom with debt's doubt and a sleepless new vocabulary for shame. That crucible bred a creed: deliver what the public wants, not what the tastemakers bless. He chased singles that worked at 2 minutes 30 on the radio, groups that fit on magazine covers, stories that could travel between continents without translation. Critics sneered. The crowd answered with chart positions. On screen, he played the villain who told the truth others wouldn't. Off screen, the schedule gnawed at him: auditions, spin-offs, formats, multiplying like mirrors in a hall. Fame granted access and extracted softness. Friends thinned. Rooms grew louder after the cameras died. Then came the scandal that stole his narrative headlines, that reduced a complicated man to a single word: betrayal. His answer was not excuses, but a quieter life, suddenly reorganized around a newborn son's laugh. "My priorities changed completely," he admitted later, a sentence that sounds simple until you taste what it costs a man built on control. Tragedy arrived without caring for chronology. He buried his father before the world learned his name, his mother after it did. In 2020, an e-bike crashed him into a statistic: 6 hours of surgery, a steel rod, the indignity of being helped to sit up in a body that once wore power like armor. Another fall in 2022 retold the joke as farce. The mirror betrayed him too. Cosmetic overcorrections froze a face that had once communicated volumes with a single surgical smirk. He said it plain, I went too far. Then he stopped choosing time over needles, memory over maintenance. And yet the empire hums. Franchises still generate numbers that make accountants grin and rivals seethe. Wealth stacks into addresses and machines. Malibu glass, London stone, a garage that idles more than it roars. But the man living inside the assets has begun writing a different ledger. He has spoken of legacy that flows outward, not a fortune to calcify a son, but opportunities for children who start where he started, outside the room unheard. That's the riddle at the heart of his arc. A judge, famous for hardness, learning to measure a life by its softness. A little-known hinge in this story is how deliberately he tuned his on-screen pauses. Producers studied it, contestants feared it, but he designed it the microbeat between critique and verdict that let a living room supply its own drama. It wasn't cruelty. It was theater calibrated to the human pulse. That understanding the architecture of suspense turned talent shows into appointment television and Simon Cowell into a metronome of modern pop culture. Still, even architecture buckles under certain winds. In September 2024, news from Buenos Aires broke the frame Liam Payne, the boy he had once greenlit, into a phenomenon gone at 31. There is no format for that, no camera angle that flattens it into entertainment. Only the reordering of a father's evenings, the tightened hug, the long look, the recognition that power can mint stars but never ensure tomorrows. So here, he stands at 65, a man who learned to tell the truth before the world did it for him. He sits on the panel, yes, but looks past the cameras towards smaller tyrannies, morning stiffness, a flicker of anxiety near stairs, the holy ordinariness of reading a bedtime story without pain. The empire remains, but the aim has shifted. Less conquest, more consequence. But why did invisibility cling to him so early? And how did that cold, airless beginning train him to hear what the world wanted before it knew it wanted it? Long before the lights, before the stages, and global applause, Simon Cowell's world was small, silent, and coldly polished. Born on October 7, 1959, in Lambeth, South London, he grew up in the suburban quiet of Elstree, Hertfordshire, a town that seemed gentle, but for Simon, it was a crucible wrapped in calm. His family looked enviable. From the outside, his mother, Julie Brett, was a ballet dancer and socialite who floated through rooms with elegance. His father, Eric Selig Philip Cowell, a music executive and property developer whose discipline was legend. But behind the well-dressed dinner parties and neat hedges affection was scarce praise, even rarer. Simon once admitted years later, with a haunting simplicity, "My father never said he was proud of me, even when I needed it most." It wasn't bitterness, it was anatomy. The absence of approval carved something permanent into him, a hollow that success would later attempt and fail to fill. Julie adored her children, but she lived in a world of performances, ballet manners, perfection. Eric respected results more than effort numbers, more than nuance. Together they raised a son who equated love with achievement, silence with disapproval. At Radlett Preparatory School and later at Dover College, Simon wasn't the prodigy his parents might have expected. He was restless, mischievous, prone to rebellion. Teachers remembered a boy who challenged authority, not out of arrogance, but out of boredom. "I was the kid who couldn't sit still," he later recalled, "and I think part of me was always trying to prove I existed." His grades suffered, his attitude hardened, and while classmates earned gold stars and praise, Simon earned warnings and detentions. The more the world scolded him, the deeper his defiance grew. His parents hoped structure would fix him. It didn't. What he learned instead was that approval was conditional, that value came only when someone else decided it. Invisible in classrooms, overlooked at home, Simon began developing an instinct for noticing what did command attention: the loudest laugh, the boldest move, the performance that made the room pause. Long before he became the judge of others, he was already studying applause, what triggered it, what silenced it, what it meant to be seen. Still, childhood wasn't void of warmth. His mother's grace left a mark. Her world of performance, of posture, poise, and perfection taught him the delicate rhythm between art and discipline. He admired it, even when he couldn't reach it. But that admiration came with pain. Julie was elegant but emotionally distant. Simon was hungry for closeness. When he failed to meet expectations, she offered silence rather than comfort. In later interviews, he described her not as cold, but unreachable, someone who demanded excellence and carried disappointment like perfume. The Cowell home was one where dreams were measured, not nurtured. There were no bedtime stories about adventure, no talk of imagination or freedom, only achievement, manners, and composure. When Simon stumbled academically, the shame was silent but heavy. The Cowells didn't shout, they disapproved. And for Simon, disapproval was worse than anger. It meant invisibility. He scraped through school with just a few GCEs in English and sociology, leaving behind not pride, but the dull weight of disappointment. In his father's world, failure wasn't a lesson, it was a stain. Out of quiet sympathy, Eric arranged a job for him in the mailroom of EMI Music, a position so low that even interns looked down. The young man who grew up under chandeliers now fetched coffee, sorted fan letters, and walked corridors where fame brushed past without noticing him. I was invisible in a world obsessed with the spotlight, he once said, a line that feels less like reflection and more like prophecy. For hours, each day he handled envelopes addressed to stars whose names filled arenas, while his own name meant nothing. Every rejection letter, every unopened parcel of fan devotion became a reminder of the distance between dreams and reality. Humiliation followed him home. He left EMI once too proud to endure it, but the outside world offered only more rejection. Each closed door seemed to whisper the same verdict: you are not enough. When he returned to EMI, it wasn't victory, it was surrender. Yet within that surrender, something began to shift. Pain curdled into drive. The silence of his childhood had not destroyed him, it had trained him. Each unnoticed day in the mailroom became a private education. He watched how producers talked, how deals were made, how power moved. He learned that charisma could open more doors than credentials, that people remembered confidence more than correctness. The boy who once craved his father's approval began realizing that in this world you didn't wait for validation, you demanded it. But even as he climbed those early invisible steps, the shadow of his childhood lingered. He had learned to equate vulnerability with weakness, kindness with danger. When affection did appear, friends, mentors, fleeting romances, he often sabotaged it without understanding why. He could read ambition in others like a psychic, but struggled to interpret love. The emotional vocabulary of his youth had no words for intimacy, only performance and achievement. This wound would shape everything that followed. It made him brilliant and relentless, but also restless and lonely. Every empire he built was in part an attempt to build the family that never fully existed. Every televised moment of triumph, each contestant's tears, each applause was a recreation of the approval he once begged for at home. The irony, cruel and cinematic, is that the more the world applauded, the less he felt seen. By his late teens, rejection had become familiar, but so had resilience. The boy who once wept quietly in his room now began to carry defiance like armor. He wasn't content to be invisible anymore. And, though the world didn't know it, the quiet rebellion of Simon Cowell's childhood was about to evolve into something far greater, an unstoppable will to make the world notice. But the road from the mailroom to the mountaintop was anything but smooth. It would be paved with bankruptcy, betrayal, and a string of failures that would nearly destroy him before he ever found success. The boy who once craved a father's pride was about to face a world that offered none. The next chapter of Simon Cowell's story didn't begin with glamour. It began with a desk stacked with other people's dreams. Back in the mailroom of EMI, the job his father had found out of pity rather than faith, Simon began watching the mechanics of fame up close. He studied the hierarchy like a military map: who took calls, who gave orders, who mattered, and who pretended to. There was something hypnotic about the way executives spoke in half sentences and numbers, how they seemed to trade emotion for certainty. Every morning, as he delivered coffee to men who didn't remember his name, he told himself that someday they would. It wasn't ambition yet, it was survival. He'd already failed to impress his father, already learned that disappointment could outlast affection. But even from the bottom rung of EMI, he began absorbing the rhythms of success, the psychology of persuasion, the seduction of confidence. In a world obsessed with perfection, he recognized something more powerful: timing. He began to see that music wasn't about notes or talent, but about moments, and moments could be engineered. He left EMI in frustration, once too humiliated to continue fetching mail, only to discover that the outside world was colder. Every interview ended with polite rejection. Every introduction evaporated once they learned who he wasn't. Swallowing pride, he returned to EMI, his name already faint on office rosters. But something inside had calcified. The boy who used to cry quietly in bathrooms was gone. What replaced him was someone who had begun to understand that being underestimated could be the sharpest weapon of all. By the early 1980s, he gambled everything on his own venture, Fanfare Records. At first it glittered. He signed Sinita, whose song So Macho stormed the charts, and suddenly the invisible boy from the mailroom was clinking glasses with producers and posing for magazine spreads. For a fleeting moment he belonged. Fame's reflection was intoxicating dinners, headlines, champagne promises. But success in the music industry ages faster than milk. The market shifted, tastes changed, and the empire he thought he was building collapsed almost overnight. Fanfare went from glitter to ghost. The contracts that once felt like passports to stardom turned into paper liabilities. By 1989, the phone stopped ringing. The company died quietly, without the dignity of a farewell. Simon was 30, broke and humiliated. He moved back into his parents' house, into the same childhood bedroom that had once smelled of teenage restlessness. Now it smelled of failure. The boy who'd once rebelled against authority was back under his parents' roof, stripped of illusion and pride. Years later, he admitted with rare fragility, "That time nearly broke me." Friends vanished, debts piled up, and the silence that filled the house at night felt like judgment. He began to wonder whether invisibility wasn't just a phase, but his destiny. Yet there's a strange alchemy in humiliation. It either corrodes or forges. For Simon, it forged. He studied his own ruin as if it were a syllabus. He realized that the people who survive this industry are not necessarily the most talented, but the most adaptive. The crowd, not the critics, decided who mattered. From that realization, his entire philosophy would be born. Sell records first, earn respect later. He clawed his way back through BMG, starting again at the bottom. No one introduced him at meetings anymore. They whispered about his bankruptcy as if it were a contagious disease. Every handshake came with the same silent question: can he deliver this time? Simon responded, not with apologies, but with audacity. He signed acts. Others mocked duos like Robson and Jerome, pop groups like five boy bands like Westlife. Critics sneered. Purists rolled their eyes. The records, however, sold millions. He understood something the others didn't. Fame is not art, it's electricity. It needs friction, spectacle, and simplicity. He didn't chase authenticity, he choreographed it. And the masses loved him for it, even as the elite despised him. For every critic who called him cheap, there were 10 million fans humming along to his vision of pop. Behind those sales was exhaustion, paranoia, and a quiet, relentless fear of collapse. For years, he carried the ghost of Fanfare's bankruptcy like a scar. Each success came with a whisper of dread. It could all vanish again. He barely slept, checking chart numbers at dawn, negotiating through meals, walking the edge between brilliance and burnout. Then in 2001 came the moment that would turn Simon Cowell into a global archetype, pop idol. At first, networks doubted him, too blunt, too cold, too British to charm audiences. They couldn't have been more wrong. Viewers didn't see cruelty in his honesty. They saw relief. In a culture drowning in politeness, Simon's scowl was liberation. The contestants' trembling vulnerability met his surgical honesty, and the world tuned in week after week to watch the collision. His raised eyebrow became a symbol, his pauses rewired television pacing, and by the time American Idol debuted in 2002, Simon Cowell was no longer the failed executive from EMI, he was the voice of judgment itself. He had turned failure into format. The same traits that once made teachers despise him, defiance, bluntness, impatience had become his superpowers. But the paradox of his rise was cruel. The higher he climbed, the lonelier it became. He had built an empire from rejection, yet he still couldn't shake the need to be accepted. Cameras replaced conversation, applause replaced affection, and the boy who once cried in silence now lived inside a mansion, echoing with it. For the world, Simon Cowell had finally made it. For Simon, the ascent only proved how far there was still to fall, and soon the price of that power, the exhaustion, the scrutiny, the emotional starvation would begin to show its cracks. By the early 2000s, Simon Cowell was no longer a man chasing the spotlight, he was the spotlight. His transformation from mailroom obscurity to global dominance seemed almost mythical. Pop Idol had erupted like wildfire across Britain, turning ordinary singers into household names and Cowell into the ultimate arbiter of talent. When American Idol launched in 2002, that mythology went international. Each week, millions gathered in front of their televisions, not merely to watch performances, but to wait for his judgment. It wasn't the music that set pulses racing, it was the pause before Simon spoke. He didn't need to shout. A sigh, a raised eyebrow, the faintest smirk, these were his instruments. They could crown or crush a dream. Television executives marveled at how a man with no acting background had turned cruelty into charisma, bluntness into theater. What his critics called arrogance, his audience recognized as truth. The public adored him for what the industry despised. He said aloud what they were all thinking. That was dreadful, he'd declare, and millions laughed because deep down they agreed. Within a few short years, he had become the most recognizable face on television across 3 continents. The X Factor followed, then Got Talent, each show a reflection of his singular philosophy. Talent might be rare, but honesty was rarer. By 2005, his programs were drawing more than 600 million viewers in over 100 countries. He wasn't just part of pop culture, he was pop culture. The money followed like gravity. His company Psycho Entertainment raked in hundreds of millions in production deals and licensing rights. He had a mansion in Beverly Hills, another in London's Holland Park, and a garage that looked like an automotive museum. The boy who once carried coffee for producers now owned the studios they worked in. Every newspaper called him the most powerful man in television. Yet power, as Simon would learn, carries an invisible tax. Fame warped perception. Wherever he went, people performed for him. Strangers wanted validation, not conversation. His phone never stopped ringing, but genuine connection became impossible. The sharp-tongued judge who could cut through illusions on stage found himself drowning in them off it. The higher he rose, the thinner the air became. Still, he played his role with precision. The white t-shirt, the fitted jeans, the monotone stare, they weren't laziness, they were branding. Simon understood that simplicity breeds iconography. His uniform became armor, his smirk a mask. But beneath that mask was a man slowly suffocating from the weight of his own legend. The schedule was merciless. Between American Idol, The X Factor, and Britain's Got Talent, Simon juggled dozens of time zones and hundreds of contestants. His life was a loop of studios, flights, and meetings. He judged while sick, strategized through holidays, and edited footage at dawn. People saw a mogul of iron discipline, Few saw the exhaustion behind his half-lidded eyes. Friends began to notice he rarely laughed anymore, not the stage laugh, but the kind that shakes the body. He once told a close friend, "It's strange to have everything you wanted and still feel like a ghost in your own life." That sentence would echo through the years like a confession he never stopped rewriting. The public image of Simon Cowell was that of a ruthless perfectionist, a man without doubt or mercy. But behind closed doors, doubt was constant. He worried about losing relevance, about younger producers replacing him, about the empire collapsing the same way fanfare had. He micromanaged everything: song selections, camera angles, even the pacing of applause. Control had become both his art form and his addiction. Then came One Direction. In 2010, 5 boys too young to vote walked into an audition room and changed not only his career, but pop music itself. Simon saw in them what the others didn't, a chemistry that couldn't be manufactured, only orchestrated. He didn't discover them, he constructed them. One by one, he fused solo hopefuls into a phenomenon. The result was lightning in a bottle. Within a year, One Direction became the biggest band on the planet, their faces on every magazine, their songs topping every chart. For Simon, they were validation incarnate, a living proof of his instinct, his power, his ability to create culture itself. But that triumph, like every triumph in his life, came with shadows. He was both mentor and machine, and the machine never slept. Reporters labeled him the king of pop television, yet in the stillness of his mansion, the title sounded hollow. He had money, fame, legacy, but little peace. Relationships wilted under the strain of his schedule. He was generous but distant, always half-present mind, orbiting around the next season, the next act, the next success. By the late 2000s, Simon's image was so vast it had stopped belonging to him. Tabloids followed his every step, dissecting his relationships, his weight, even his smile. Each vacation photo became a headline, each remark a potential scandal, and though he wore indifference like a second skin, the scrutiny cut deeper than he admitted. "They don't see you as a person," he once said quietly. "They see you as a character they created." But for all the fatigue, for all the isolation, Simon never stopped performing. His empire had momentum, and momentum doesn't allow grief. He was an idol maker trapped in the machinery of his own making. Audiences saw his sneer. They didn't see the man behind it, clutching antacids between commercial breaks, eyes glassy from overwork. He was powerful, yes, but he was also profoundly human, and humans eventually break. The irony of his empire was devastating. The man who helped millions chase their dreams had no time to live his own. When contestants wept after being told no, they were mourning something Simon had lost long ago, the innocence of believing that success brings happiness. As the 2010s dawned, he stood at a height few would ever reach. But success in Simon's world was never a plateau. It was a balancing act over a bottomless pit. Every empire he built carried the faint hum of collapse. Every show, another reminder that the crowd's applause was borrowed, not earned forever. He had become a global icon, but at what cost? Beneath the lights, beneath the laughter, and the numbers, his reflection was beginning to fracture. And when cracks appear in the mirror, they have a way of spreading fast. The story of Simon Cowell's downfall wasn't written by his rivals or his ratings. It began quietly, in the very place he had built his kingdom, the stage. Every empire eventually meets the weight of its own gravity. For Simon Cowell, the fall came not from failure of talent, but from the exhaustion of living as an idea. By the early 2010s, the very formula that had made him a titan began to turn on him. His face, once synonymous with power, was now a caricature in the tabloids. Cruel, heartless, plastic. The same bluntness that once thrilled audiences now seemed outdated in a world craving empathy over honesty. The shows still drew millions, but the man behind them had begun to erode. In 2013, the headlines that shattered his carefully built myth arrived with surgical precision. Simon Cowell expecting child with Lauren Silverman, the wife of his close friend, Andrew Silverman. It was not just scandal, it was betrayal broadcast to the world. The industry that once worshipped his control watched gleefully as he lost it. He wasn't the judge anymore, he was the judged. Tabloids dissected every word, every gesture, every silence. Overnight, Simon Cowell, architect of public humiliation, became its latest victim. Friends disappeared, business partners hesitated, his empire trembled under the weight of gossip. But perhaps the cruelest part wasn't public ridicule, it was private guilt. The man who'd built a life on ruthless clarity found himself staring into a mirror clouded by shame. It wasn't something I'm proud of, he admitted later. The sentence hung in interviews like a confession too late to save him. For the first time in decades, Simon Cowell wanted to disappear. And yet, from that humiliation came something no headline could predict: rebirth. When his son Eric was born in 2014, Simon's story veered from scandal to salvation. My priorities changed completely, he said. And for once, the words weren't scripted. He stopped chasing ratings and started chasing laughter, the small, untelevised kind that lived inside bedtime stories. Eric became his redemption. The empire paused, replaced by Lego towers, children's books, and the soft language of fatherhood. He saved him, a friend later said. Simon was on a dark path, and Eric pulled him back. But the scandal had left scars. The loss of friendships, the whispers that followed him into rooms, the permanent shadow of betrayal, it never fully faded. Then in 2015 came a wound deeper than any public shaming: the death of his mother, Julie Brett. She had been the silent witness to his rebellions, the one person whose pride he'd sought his entire life. Her passing left him unmoored. Losing my mom was the hardest thing I've ever gone through, he confessed. For a man defined by control, grief was chaos. No ratings victory, no contract renewal could fill the silence she left behind. And just as he began to find balance again, life decided balance was a luxury he didn't deserve. In August 2020, at 60 years old, Simon tested a new electric bike in the courtyard of his Malibu home. A moment's miscalculation turned curiosity into catastrophe. He was thrown violently to the ground, his back shattered in multiple places, 6 hours of surgery, a steel rod in his spine. Doctors warned that a wrong movement could mean paralysis. The titan of television, the man who ruled primetime with a flick of his eyebrow, now couldn't lift a glass of water. His empire went dark, cameras replaced by hospital monitors, lights replaced by morphine drips. I came within a minute of not making it, he said later, voice stripped of bravado. Nights became endless corridors of pain. The man who had survived scandal and ridicule now fought for the simple act of standing. But the cruelest pain wasn't physical, it was emotional. The thought that his 6-year-old son might grow up without him haunted every hour. I thought of Eric, he said, and I knew I had to fight. Those words, simple trembling, carried more truth than any television moment ever had. His recovery was a brutal resurrection. Months of therapy, sleepless nights, small victories measured in inches. And then, as if the universe hadn't finished mocking him, in early 2022, it happened again. Another e-bike accident, another crash. This time his arm shattered, his face bruised, his pride annihilated. The tabloids feasted. Cowell crashes again, mocking him as reckless, fragile, foolish. He laughed publicly, but privately, he wondered if fate was trying to humble him beyond recognition. Each fall forced a new reckoning. He began questioning everything: his vanity, his empire, even his reflection. Years of cosmetic enhancements had left his face frozen, swollen, unrecognizable. The man who once judged others for authenticity now hid behind artifice. I went too far, he admitted. In 2021, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. That line was more than confession. It was rebirth. He stopped the procedures, let the wrinkles return, let the face he'd earned resurface. For once, Simon Cowell allowed himself to age, to be human, to surrender. It was the most honest decision of his life. The judge had finally judged himself, but tragedy wasn't finished circling. In September 2024, news broke that Liam Payne, The boy he had discovered at 16, the young man he had turned into a global superstar, had died after a fall from a hotel balcony in Buenos Aires. Liam was only 31. The headlines blurred, but the pain was crystalline. Simon didn't just lose a former artist, he lost a piece of his legacy, a surrogate son. He withdrew from public life. No cameras, no statements, only silence. Too young, too cruel, he whispered to a friend. For a man who had built his empire on sound voices, applause music, the silence was unbearable. He began spending evenings with Eric, rewatching grainy audition tapes of One Direction, the band he had once assembled with the precision of a sculptor. Each laugh, each lyric was both memory and wound. That tragedy broke something in him that business could not mend. He began to speak less about competition and more about compassion, less about empire, more about endurance. He once ruled television with a sneer. Now his greatest power was gentleness. The man who once defined success as domination now defined it as survival. By the time he returned to Got Talent, the transformation was complete. He wasn't the villain anymore. His critiques had softened into counsel, his smirk into something almost kind. The audience still cheered, but the tone had changed. They weren't applauding his power anymore. They were honoring his humanity. Simon Cowell's tragedy was never about failure. It was about fragility. The man who once demanded perfection had learned that imperfection was the only thing that kept him alive. But even redemption comes with shadows. His health still faltered, his sleep still broke. The man who once judged millions now judged himself, not with cruelty, but with the ache of understanding. And behind the softened smile of television's harshest judge, one question lingered: had the empire been worth the cost? By his early 60s, Simon Cowell had outlived the caricature the world made of him. The sharp-tongued judge, the ruthless mogul, the unflinching critic, all those masks had slipped away, leaving behind a man quietly trying to repair what fame had fractured. The years of power had brought him wealth, but also wreckage, a broken spine, a broken image, and the slow-burning fear that time was no longer on his side. At home in Beverly Hills, the rhythms of his life changed. Mornings began not with conference calls, but with careful stretches prescribed by therapists. The steel rod in his back was a daily reminder that the body keeps score. Some days he could move freely, on others pain sat on his shoulders like an old creditor. His doctor called it residual trauma. Simon called it rent for survival. His diet became another battlefield. Low sodium for blood pressure, low sugar for stability, antioxidants for fatigue. He joked that he ate like a man negotiating with his body, one bite at a time. Yet for the first time he listened. The man who once drove himself to exhaustion now measured success by how slowly he could breathe. The irony was beautiful and cruel. The mogul who once judged talent by its ability to stir emotion now learned to appreciate silence. He spent afternoons walking along Malibu's coast with Eric, sometimes talking, often not. The ocean did the speaking, endless, impartial, unbothered by ratings. That's where I remember what matters, he told a friend. Work still existed, but differently. Got Talent continued the machine humming on habit and legacy, but Simon no longer needed to dominate the stage. He spoke less, listened more. Contestants noticed. The glare in his eyes softened. Criticism came dressed as mentorship. It's not about being right anymore, he said on set. It's about being useful. Those who had once feared his judgment now sought his approval like warmth. Age also stripped away vanity. The fillers were gone, the Botox abandoned. His hair carried streaks of gray, his face lined with the geography of survival. He called it honest aging. When interviewers mentioned his transformation, he smiled faintly. I finally look like someone who's lived a life, he said. And indeed he did. But health was still a fragile truce. His eyesight had begun to betray him. Years of studio lights and strain left him squinting at teleprompters, fumbling for reading glasses. I can handle pain, he admitted, but I can't stand not seeing clearly. Behind that fear was something deeper, the dread of not being able to see his son's face one day. For a man who built empires on perception, blindness was the cruelest threat of all. Yet despite the limitations, his evenings glowed with something close to peace. He and Eric played piano badly, rode bikes cautiously, built Lego castles with the same intensity he once brought to television contracts. "These are my auditions now," he joked, "and he's the only judge that matters." Money, once the measure of everything, lost its shine. His net worth, estimated over 600 million, had become background noise. The private jet flew rarely. The supercars mostly gathered dust. When asked what he wanted Eric to inherit, his answer was immediate. Not money, values. He began redirecting his fortune into causes that echoed the voids of his own childhood: creative education, children's healthcare scholarships for kids who start with nothing. "I want to give them the chances I never had," he said, meaning it. In interviews, he sounded less like a businessman and more like a philosopher, reluctant to admit it. "We spend our lives chasing applause," he said once, "but it doesn't fill the silence when everyone's gone home." That sentence, stripped of showmanship, carried the wisdom of someone who had finally stepped outside the noise. At 65, Simon Cowell's world has narrowed, but in that narrowing, he's found clarity. His mornings hurt, his nights are quiet, but his heart, after decades of guarding it behind iron, beats without disguise. The boy who once begged for his father's pride now watches his own son laugh and realizes that approval is not inherited, it's given. The empire still stands, but Simon no longer worships it. The man who once taught the world how to judge has learned at last how to forgive. But legacy has a strange aftertaste. What remains of Simon Cowell when the cameras fade, when the shows stop, when even the echoes of his name start to dissolve? To measure Simon Cowell's legacy is to measure a paradox. A man who built empires from other people's voices but spent decades searching for his own. His shows pop idol. The X Factor Got Talent did more than entertain. They rewired the DNA of global television. Before Simon, talent shows were local curiosities. After him, they were nations' rituals. He didn't invent competition, but he industrialized aspiration. He taught the world that stardom could be manufactured, packaged, and exported like a product, and in doing so, he changed what audiences expected from authenticity itself. When American Idol aired, the world saw contestants as heroes of modern myth: the grocery clerk, the single mother, the shy teenager with a dream. But behind the camera, it was Simon who played the high priest of that myth. His presence gave structure to chaos. Every yes he uttered became a secular blessing, every no a televised scar. He wasn't just judging voices, he was shaping a culture of public confession. The audition room became a confessional booth where ordinary people sought absolution through talent. To some, that was genius. To others, it was cruelty disguised as entertainment. Either way, it was unforgettable. Simon Cowell made honesty viral. He made silence suspenseful. He made rejection dramatic art. His legacy is not only the millions of records sold or the hundreds of careers launched, it's the new language of modern television, where emotion is currency and every performance is an act of survival. But cultural impact is rarely gentle. For every superstar he created, Kelly Clarkson, Leona Lewis, One Direction, there were hundreds who left the stage broken, carrying the echo of his disapproval. Critics accused him of commodifying dreams, of turning vulnerability into spectacle. They weren't wrong, yet the contradiction was what made him fascinating. Simon's brutality was never sadism, it was in a way faith. He believed that truth, even when cruel, was kinder than delusion. Still, as decades passed, the machine he built began to age. Reality TV multiplied and cheapened. Sincerity became a brand. The world learned to mimic his tone without understanding its origin. By the 2020s, newer formats emerged, softer, more performative, while Simon himself grew quieter, more human. He had spent years selling hope to strangers, yet found his own redemption not in empire but in empathy. His influence, however, remains indelible. The pause before judgment, the camera close-up on trembling contestants, the slow orchestral swell before verdict, all of it traces back to him. Even streaming-era shows owe their pacing to the rhythm he invented. In a cultural sense, Simon Cowell taught us how to feel tension, how to wait for catharsis, how to find meaning in a raised eyebrow. But perhaps his true legacy lies outside television, in philanthropy, in fatherhood, in the humility he wears like a second skin. After his accidents, he began funding children's hospitals and creative programs, determined to leave behind more than formats and ratings. His money once used to build walls, now builds futures. "I don't want to be remembered for television," he said quietly in an interview. "I want to be remembered for making something good out of what I've learned." What he learned painfully was that perfection isolates, and that the real currency of influence isn't power, it's presence. The world still sees Simon Cowell as a titan, but those closest to him describe something gentler, a man who finally stopped running from the silence that used to terrify him. He no longer needs to fill it with noise. His shows will one day fade, replaced by new algorithms of fame, but the template he carved into pop culture will remain. He redefined success for an age addicted to visibility. He proved that being unforgettable isn't the same as being loved, and that sometimes the two can't coexist. And that is the tragedy and triumph of Simon Cowell's legacy. He gave the world its voice, but in the process almost lost his own. Yet even as the world moves on, his story lingers, a warning, a mirror, a myth that still hums beneath the static of Saturday night television. But every legacy hides a debate. Was Simon Cowell a visionary who democratized fame, or a merchant who sold dreams too easily? It's easy to judge Simon Cowell by the caricature, sharp suit, sharper tongue, the man who built an empire from other people's hopes. But the truth, as always, is messier, more human, more tragic. When you strip away the myth, what remains isn't a villain or a hero, but a survivor of his own creation. Simon Cowell's achievements are undeniable. He didn't just find stars, he built an entire generation of them. Without him, there would be no American Idol as we know it, no X Factor, no Got Talent, phenomenon spanning continents. He discovered or developed voices that carried across decades: Kelly Clarkson, Leona Lewis, Susan Boyle, One Direction. He made the impossible seem procedural, turning ordinary lives into primetime miracles. He democratized fame, giving the public power once held by record executives and critics. That was his genius, transforming talent into participation. But for all the dreams he enabled, he also revealed something haunting about us. We didn't just watch those shows for the music, we watched to witness judgment, to see a human being rise or crumble under a sentence. Simon gave the audience what they secretly craved: permission to feel superior, permission to mock, permission to judge. His brilliance was also his moral burden. He became the mirror that reflected our hunger for spectacle, and in that mirror he sometimes disappeared. People called him ruthless, but what they mistook for cruelty was in part projection. The same wound that drove his ambition, the father's silence, the childhood invisibility, was the wound he exposed in others. He knew what it felt like to crave validation, and he also knew the cost of chasing it too long. Every contestant who stood trembling before him was in some way a reflection of himself, the invisible child begging to be seen. And yet, when history writes about Simon Cowell, it shouldn't be as a destroyer of dreams, but as a man who tested them. He believed in meritocracy long before it was fashionable. He made art compete with commerce and dared to say out loud that the public, not the critics, were the real judges. That brutal honesty reshaped entertainment forever. Still, the story that began with dominance ends with humility. The empire stands, yes, but its architect has grown weary of walls. His later interviews sound like confessionals, regrets about lost friends, about chasing youth through cosmetic alchemy, about forgetting what mattered until tragedy forced him to remember. The man who once measured worth in applause now measures it in the quiet of fatherhood, in the laugh of a boy named Eric. There's something almost poetic in that arc. A man who spent decades deciding who was worthy, finally learning to grant worth freely. The iron judge discovering tenderness. The empire builder finding peace not in control but in surrender. It's not redemption in the cinematic sense. It's quieter than that, more honest, more human. Simon Cowell's story is not a morality tale. It's a cautionary echo about the hunger that drives success and the emptiness that often follows. He reminds us that the spotlight is not a place, but a temperature warm at first, then scalding, and that the same light that illuminates us eventually blinds us if we stand in it too long. In the end, perhaps the question isn't whether Simon Cowell was too harsh, too vain, or too ambitious. The question is whether we as an audience demanded too much from him. We asked him to entertain, to judge, to stay ageless, to never falter. He gave us everything, and when he finally cracked, we called it news instead of mercy. So here in this channel's opinion, Simon Cowell stands as one of television's great contradictions, a man who weaponized truth yet spent a lifetime running from his own. His tragedy is not that he fell, but that even in falling, the cameras never looked away. And maybe that's what makes his story worth telling, because beneath every empire lies one fragile truth, that greatness and loneliness are often the same sound echoing in different rooms. But one last question remains, the kind only reflection can answer. When the applause fades and the lights dim, who judges the judge? The story of Simon Cowell is no longer about ratings or riches. It's about a man learning how to live without an audience. When you watch him today, his movements slower, his voice softer. You can almost see the weight of time resting on his shoulders like an old friend. The empire hums on, yes, but he walks through it like a ghost in a house he built too large to ever feel at home in. Sometimes in rare interviews, you catch a flicker of something that was never part of his television persona, gentleness. When asked about his past, he no longer defends it. He smiles and says, "I've made a lot of mistakes, but I think I've learned what matters." The smirk is still there faintly, but behind it lives gratitude, the kind that comes only after you've survived everything you thought would destroy you. He spends his days in Malibu now, surrounded not by executives or cameras, but by sunlight, laughter, and the sound of the ocean breaking against the rocks below his home. Eric, growing fast, is the center of his small universe. In the quiet moments, the ones with no lights, no applause, no edits, Simon is just a father reading bedtime stories, a man grateful for mornings that don't hurt too much. Still, he carries his ghosts, the faces of contestants whose dreams he crushed, the parents he lost before he could fully say goodbye, the mirror that once showed a stranger, the ache in his spine that hums like memory. But in the stillness, all of it softens. For the first time, perhaps, Simon Cowell has stopped trying to be someone and has simply learned how to be. His story lingers because it isn't just about fame, it's about fragility. It's a reminder that even the harshest judges need forgiveness, that even the strongest fall, and that success in its purest form is learning how to stand again when no one's watching. And as the credits of his life begin to fade, we're left with an image not of power or arrogance, but of a man sitting quietly beside his son, watching the sunset stretch across the Pacific. No stage, no audience, just light and the long echo of a life that finally found peace in its imperfections. Some stories end with applause, his ends with understanding, because Simon Cowell's greatest creation was never Idol or The X Factor or Got Talent. It was himself, a man who turned failure into empire, cruelty into honesty, and pain into purpose. And somewhere within that long journey from silence to spotlight and back again, we discover the simplest, most haunting truth of all. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now you know.